The Indian Army conducts a second surgical strike in Myanmar. The surgical strike launched at the Myanmar border. Firing between Myanmar terror outfits and the Indian Army has been reported. Reports of many terrorists being killed in the surgical strike. This is the second surgical strike that the Indian Army has conducted in Myanmar. The surgical strike has been launched at the Myanmar border. This is the initial detail that's coming in from this report, this breaking development coming in. Firing reported between the Myanmar terror outfit NSCN and the Indian Army. There are reports of many NSCN terrorists being killed in the surgical strike. As per the initial details that are coming in, there is a second surgical strike that's been conducted by the Indian Army in Myanmar. The surgical strike was launched at the Myanmar border. Firing between the Myanmar terror outfit NSCN and the Indian Army have been reported. There are also reports coming in of many NSCN terrorists that have been killed in the surgical strike. These are, of course, only initial details that are coming in. The Indian Army carries out another surgical strike alongside the Myanmar border. Remember, in June last year, the NSCN had ambushed an Indian Army convoy of 6 Dogra Regiment in the Chandel district of Manipur and killed 18 army jawans. And in retaliation, on June 10th last year, India had conducted surgical strikes against terrorist camps along the Indo-Myanmar international border. Indian media had reported the casualty figure as high as 158 at that time. And now reports coming in of a second surgical strike that's been conducted by the Indian Army alongside the Myanmar border. Let's go straight across to our correspondent Raghavendra Rao, who's getting us the very latest. Raghavendra, what are the initial details that you have at this point?
Well, yes, the initial details which are coming in is that there has been an engagement with NSCN-K cadre militants, and heavy casualties have been inflicted on the NSCN-K cadres, and no casualties by the Indian security forces, which was being reported earlier. This firefight happened along the Indo-Myanmar border at 4:45 a.m. today. And what the Defense Ministry sources and the sources in the government of India are telling us very, very unequivocally is that this operation was not a surgical strike, and basically it was an operation which was along the border, and at no the Indian troops crossed the border to strike at these militants. So that needs to be emphasized, that this was not a surgical strike, and has tweeted about the fact that the operation was happening along the Indo-Myanmar border at around 4:45 a.m. today, and heavy indeed have been inflicted on the NSCN cadres. But to call it a surgical strike would be incorrect, and that is the sense we are getting from our sources.
Let's go straight across also to WION's political editor Kartikeya Sharma, who's joining us for more on this. As Raghavendra Rao, correspondent, was just pointing out, Kartikeya, there is no certainty that this was a surgical strike. What are you gathering at this point?
You see, there are a couple of things last time when the I would say I'll go by my colleague Raghavendra, but the sort of operation now which is being reported is something which I would say is of great importance. And secondly, what has Eastern Command tweeted? Let me take you through the tweets of the Eastern Command. It says, heavy casualties reportedly inflicted on NSCN-K cadre, no casualties suffered by Indian security force. Then it goes on to say that reports of casualties to Indian Army personnel factually incorrect. Firefighting occurred along India-Myanmar border at 04:45 hours today, which means it took place quite some time back. You know, as we speak, it's not taking place as we speak. It took place in the wee hours. So that way, the word surgical strike has not been used. But see, nonetheless, I will not come to any conclusion whether it qualifies as a surgical strike or not. But what it qualifies as a strong response of Indian government when it comes to the terrorist organization. And secondly, whether they crossed, whether the firing took place on border, whether it is like an LOC type firing which is taking place in Punj, or whether they go inside or not, we'll have to wait for the formal press conference. But for now, I think the important thing here is that it is very clear that there was an action which was taken by the Eastern Command, and Eastern Command has, in the Twitter feed of the Eastern Command says that we have inflicted heavy damages, and the Twitter feed also says heavy casualties have been inflicted on NSCN-K cadre. Now, this is important in the sense that, if you remember, Prime Minister has reached some sort of an understanding with Nagas, but that draft has not been made public. And that became an issue even during Manipur election as to what sort of an understanding that the Prime Minister has reached them. But apart from that, the operations like these have intensified. I see this in context of the proximity which Narendra Modi showed in terms of with Myanmar government when he took a position on the Rohingya issue. Now, the larger picture falls into place that India perhaps is far more interested in certain other issues which affects his own territory, which is terrorist organizations operating from the regional or the western flanks of Myanmar. Thirdly, it also tells me that the surgical strike which took place earlier was not one-off. This will continue to take place. And lastly, one of the key figures of Naga insurgency also passed away, because Naga groups are divided into two major groups. It's not one NSCN. NSCN is in two parts, NSCN-K and NSCN-Muiwa. So the casualties which are being reported, it is being said that NSCN-K cadre, it's not the Muiwa cadre, it's the K cadre which has been attacked, a smaller but equally potent in its effectiveness to, inflict damages on Indian security forces. They have been operating for quite some time. So that way it becomes very, very important. Other details would eventually flow in. I would like to remind our viewers that last time, though I would not use the word surgical here, that is for the government of India to say, as to qualify the anti-terrorist operation. You would remember, Molly, last time there was a press conference done by a single star officer at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is Jawaharlal Nehru Bhavan, and he went on to inform that the surgical strikes have taken place. We'll have to wait and see whether that sort of dressing up of this event will take place or not, but nonetheless, a very potent anti-Naga operation has taken place.
A very potent anti-Naga operation is the initial detail that we have as of now. Let's go straight across to analyst Kamar Agha, also joining us on the broadcast for more on this. What do you make of these initial details that are trickling in the Eastern Command? And I'd like to also point out again, this is the tweet that's been put out by the Eastern Command. Heavy casualties reported inflicted on the NSCN-K cadre. No casualties suffered by the Indian security forces. Mr. Agha, your initial reaction. Mr. Kamar Agha, my voice is going through to you.
Fled from the spot. As per inputs, a large number of casualties were suffered by the insurgents. Our troops suffered no casualties during the firefight. It is reiterated that our troop did not cross the international border. I think it is being clarified. The statement, we have the statement which is being provided. The statement clearly says that the Indian troops did not cross the border. And this is very important to clarify that a lot of other channels were reporting various different aspects of this. It has been clarified by the Eastern Command of the Army, but nonetheless, What is important here is that heavy firefighting did take place, and Indian Army, the Eastern Command of the Army says that heavy casualties has been inflicted, which means, to my knowledge, that it was an operation involving large number of soldiers and heavy duty material, in which means that not only light machine guns were involved, but heavy machine guns and heavy weaponry was used. Back to you, Molly.
Absolutely. Stay with me, please, Karthikeya. These, of course, are the initial reactions, but the statement on today's firefight on our screens that's been released by the Eastern Command just a few moments ago, and in the early morning hours of 27 September, a column of Indian Army, while operating along the Indo-Myanmar troops, reacted swiftly and brought down heavy retaliatory fire on the insurgents. The insurgents then broke contact and fled from the spot. As per inputs, a large number of casualties were suffered by the insurgents. Own troops suffered no casualties during the firefight. It is reiterated that own troops did not cross the international border. There we have strongly worded statement and a clarification rather also coming in from the Eastern Command. Let's go across also to our correspondent Ramesh Ramachandran, who has more details. Over to you, Ramesh.
Thank you, Molly. The incident is understood to have taken place at about 4:45 in the morning along the India-Myanmar border. And as you just read out, the official statement put out by the Indian Defence Ministry, especially the Army, it says that there was no crossing of the international border between India and Myanmar. And that, to my mind, is significant. Initial reports suggested that this was another surgical strike. Remember, India conducted one surgical strike, the first in this government's tenure, in June 2015 along the India-Myanmar border. That was followed by another surgical strike across the line of control that divides the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir in September of last year. So this was seen as a surgical strike, but the official statement clarifies that this was a gunfight that broke out early this morning, and that the NSCN-K, or the Khaplang faction, suffered heavy casualties in that gunfire.
Absolutely. Stay with me, please, Ramesh and Karthikeya as well. We have more voices joining us in the broadcast as we continuously monitor the latest developments coming in. Also joining us is defense expert Sushant Sareen. So what do you make of this statement that's been put out by the Eastern Command? It is a strong retaliatory action that's been taken by the forces there. Your initial reaction?
Well, I think the statement which has been put out by the Eastern Command is precisely the sort of anodyne statement that they should put out. Clearly, India cannot, as say that we went into the territory of another country, even if it was with the knowledge of that country, because that country itself would not want us to accept that. So I think the formulation is that it was carried out along the border, that there was an ambush, we retaliated, we inflicted heavy casualties, but probably the reality is somewhat different. And it would have
Why
been...
do you say that, sir?
I say that because that is what the sense which one gets about this kind of an operation. Because there wouldn't be this kind of, a statement coming out if, these fellows had come into Indian territory and were trying to attack some Indian convoy or some Indian patrol or establishment somewhere inside the Indian border. Normally, it does not happen. So I think the statement is diplomatically correct, but probably the reality is quite similar to what happened more than a year back when the Indian troops had crossed the border and struck at NSCN camps in Myanmar. Now, we don't want to say that because, the Myanmaris wouldn't want us to say it, and which is as good as it comes. But the fact of the matter is, I think the signaling is that the gloves are off. There are no safe havens which will be tolerated. And if any terrorists think that they can operate with impunity from outside India's borders, then they have another thought coming. Clearly, this is an action which is aimed at dispelling that impression which many of these groups have, that they can just step across over the border and then they are safe. Clearly, they are not going to be safe, neither on the east nor on the west. The method of operation might differ on either side of the border, but, the retaliation is a possibility which no longer can be ruled out. So that's in a sense the new reality and the new normal.
Right, sir. Request you to please hold that thought. I believe our correspondent Ramesh Ramachandran has further details for us. Over to you, Ramesh.
Thank you, Molly. I just wanted to make two quick points, essentially taking off from the point where Sultan Serene left. Now, the first point is that this comes before the first anniversary of the 2016 surgical strike across the line of control, as I said, divides the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. This was in retaliation to the terrorist attack that took place at Uri in September last year. That's point number one. The second point is more to do with the timing of this operation along the India-Myanmar border. To my mind, this can be, might be, and probably will be used by the Indian government to suggest, to tell the world that India needs the government of Myanmar on its side. And this comes in the face of criticism that India has been shying away from calling or telling the Myanmarese government to act tough on the Rohingya issue. And that, to my mind, this operation can probably be used by India to tell the world that India needs Myanmar on its side, especially given the insurgent groups that operate on either side of the Indian-Myanmar. But therefore, the timing of this operation assumes that much more significance.
I was just coming to that as well, Ramesh. This coming in very close on the heels of the Army Chief Bipin Rawat there saying earlier this week that India may conduct more surgical strikes. This, of course, at the moment, the Eastern Command has maintained this was an operation only carried out along the border, reiterating that own troops did not cross the international border. But this is, of course, a strong retaliatory action that's been taken. Ramesh, as far as the timing of this attack is concerned, of course, the kind of retaliatory action that's been taken by the Indian forces here assumes significance.
Absolutely, Molly. Now, India has been at the receiving end of international criticism to a large extent in view of its soft peddling on the issue of the Rohingya crisis. Remember, India and Myanmar have had a traditional, long-standing relationship that spans decades now, and India was always seen as an ally and trusted partner of the military junta in Myanmar for decades on end. And after the transition to the Myanmarese democracy, as we are seeing it unfold before our eyes today, especially in light of the Rohingya crisis, India was under considerable pressure to take a stand against the Myanmarese government and tell and lean on Naypyidaw to get it to act on the humanitarian crisis unfolding before our own very eyes. And to my mind, this morning's incident along the India-Myanmar border will come handy for New Delhi to deflect international criticism of its actions or no action on the Rohingya crisis, and India will use it to its advantage to tell the world that, look, the government of Myanmar's support is crucial for India to counter the insurgent groups operating on both sides of the India-Myanmar border, and therefore this morning's operation would have come handy.
Absolutely, Ramesh. And also, if we look at the first tweet that's been put out by the Eastern Command, this coming just a short while back, in a way, the impetus seems to be reports that were coming in earlier to the effect that the Indian Army personnel had suffered casualties. So that's, of course, a clarification that was first given out by the Eastern Command through that tweet that first came in, saying that reports of casualties to Indian Army personnel are factually incorrect. The firefight occurred along the Indo-Myanmar border at 4:45 hours today. No casualties suffered by the Indian security forces was a follow-up tweet. So in a way, Ramesh, more than a statement, this was a clarification to begin with from the very outset that was given out by the Eastern Command.
Absolutely, Molly. And if I leave the issue of timing aside for a moment, Molly, the clear message that goes out from this morning's operation, seen or read together with two similar operations in the recent past. Remember, in June 2015, India conducted a surgical strike along the India-Myanmar border, again targeting the NSCN-Khaplang faction. In September last year, the first anniversary of which is only coming up in the next few days, India conducted a surgical strike across the line of control in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, targeting terrorist launch pads operated and aided and abetted by Pakistani state agencies. So the message that is going out is loud and clear that thus far and no further, India will adopt a zero-tolerance policy towards terrorism, and India will go all out to take out such camps be they exist anywhere along the international border on either side, be it west or east. And this sentiment was reflected most recently, Molly, in the political declaration adopted by the BJP National Executive, which concluded in New Delhi, which specifically mentioned about zero tolerance for terrorism and that India will be resolute in its actions to defend its interests, be they anywhere along the international border. So that, therefore, this morning's incident should be seen in light of the new dynamic that is obtaining in South Asia, where India will call out countries who are aiding and abetting terrorism and will take all actions to defend its national interests anywhere in the region.
Stay with me, please, Ramesh. Let's also take our viewers through that statement once again, that statement that was put out by the Eastern Command just a short while back. And I'm going to read it out once again. In the early morning hours of 27 September, a column of the Indian Army, while operating along the Indo-Myanmar border, was fired upon by unidentified insurgents. Own troops reacted swiftly and brought down heavy retaliatory fire on the insurgents. The insurgents then broke contact and fled from the spot. As per inputs, a large number of casualties were suffered by the insurgents. Own troops suffered no casualties during the firefight. It is reiterated that own troops did not cross the international border. That is the statement that was put out by the Eastern Command just a short while after tweets that also came in from the official handle there, saying that reports of casualties to the Indian Army personnel are factually incorrect. Firefight occurred along the Indo-Myanmar border at 4:45 hours today. Heavy casualties reportedly inflicted on the NSCN-K cadre. No casualties suffered by the Indian security forces. Important also to highlight here that the timing, as we've been discussing with our correspondent Ramesh Ramachandran all throughout, extremely significant. This, of course, is a clarification that was issued by the Eastern Command, and as per the initial reports that were coming in, there's a clarification saying that own troops did not cross the international border. So that is the confirmation. This is, of course, coming in close on the heels of the Army Chief Bipin Rawat saying earlier this week that India may conduct more surgical strikes if required. But at the same time, important to reiterate that the Indian troops did not cross the international border. That, of course, is the official statement that's been put out by the Eastern Command there. I would like to go back to Kamar Agha if he's still with us. Mr. Agha, as we've been discussing, the timing of this operation, of this retaliatory fire becoming extremely significant in the light of the scenario, also given the reactions that have been coming in from the Indian side regarding the Rohingya crisis. I believe we've lost that line with Mr. Agha, but going back across to our correspondent Raghavendra Rao, who was getting us the very latest. Raghavendra, we have, of course, put out for our viewers that statement that's been released by the Eastern Command, also the clarifications that came in the run-up to that statement, very clearly pointing out that the Indian troops did not cross the international border and no casualties were suffered by the Indian security forces. Take us through the latest that we know at this point.
Well, indeed, Molly, and this operation began in the wee hours of today, early morning, around 4:45 along the Indo-Myanmar border, where Indian troops engaged with these militants of the NSCN-K. Now, there is some reason to believe that many of these terrorists had indeed infiltrated from the Myanmarese side into the Indian territory. A heavy firefight happened for a few hours at least, and the Indian troops have inflicted heavy casualties on the NSCN-K cadres. We must not forget that only a few days back we had a similar skirmish along the Indo-Myanmar border. So these operations have been going on for a while. Yes, the moment this news started trickling in, there was a belief that probably Indian Army had crossed over into the Myanmarese side and had inflicted surgical strikes on these camps of these NSCN-K militants. But our sources are confirming to us that no cross-border action has taken place. All the gunfight, all the firefight, and the entire operation was limited to the Indian side of the Indo-Myanmar border. Along the border, yes, both sides engaged in firefight, in gunfight, and Indian side, the Indian army, Indian troops have inflicted heavy casualties on these militants, and there were also initially some reports suggesting that there were casualties on the Indian army side. Those have also been refuted by the Indian defense establishment. A major operation indeed, and one in which a huge presence of these militants have been executed and exterminated.
Absolutely. Stay on with us, please, Raghavendra, as we continue to break down the very latest that's emerging regarding that strong retaliatory action that's been taken by the Indian forces there. The statements also that have been put out by the Eastern Command. We will continue to track the very latest coming in on that front. For now, I'm taking it over to my colleague Daniele Pagani for getting us the very latest. He will take over from here. Daniele?
Yes, for the benefit of our viewers who might have just connected with us, this is a big breaking news coming in. The Indian Army conducted a second surgical strike close to the border to Myanmar. It is important to state that the Indian troops did not cross the border, so they did not enter Myanmar. A surgical strike was launched on the Myanmarese border, firing between Myanmar terror outfit NSCN-K and the Indian Army. There are reports of many NCCN-K terrorists being killed, so heavy casualties in this surgical strike, but also there are reports of absolutely no casualties suffered by the Indian troops deployed on the border. And live with us we have Raghavendra Rao and Ramesh Ramachandra, both our senior correspondents. Raghavendra, over to you. I would like to ask you to walk a little bit our viewers through this kind of area, how restive it is, how dangerous it is. What kind of place are we talking about when we talk about the Indo-Myanmarese border?
Well, Daniele, this entire border between India and Myanmar, touching 4 northeastern states, it's a free movement area because, as per the established, law and procedure in that area, there is easy entry allowed into both countries. Those people who are residing within 16 kilometers of the border, both on the Indian and the Myanmarese side, they do not need a visa to go to either side. All they need is a permit, and that's a free movement area, a designated free movement area for the facilitation of residents on both sides of the border. Now, what has been happening is that many of these terrorist and militant groups have also been exploiting this particular provision we have, and also in their routine usual operations, they try to cross over the Indo-Myanmar border into the Indian territory, inflict damages here on the army, on the civilian establishments, on the civilian institutions. And what they do is, after conducting their operations, they run back into the Myanmarese territory, thinking that they'll find a safe refuge, a safe haven there. We have had an operation in the past wherein the Indian armies actually chased these militants down to Myanmar in the Myanmarese territory. Although even at that time it was not confirmed in as many words by the Indian establishment, but the larger sense was that the Indian soldiers had indeed crossed over the border into Myanmarese territory, went inside a few kilometers, and had demolished and destroyed many of their terror launch pads. But in today's incident, today's gunfight and firefight which has happened along the border, the sense we are getting from our sources in the Defense Ministry is that it was an operation which was restricted to the Indian side of the Indo-Myanmar border.
Right.
It was right along the border, and at no given point in time, the Indian troops crossed over into Myanmarese territory. What they say for sure is that, yes, these NSCN-K militants, they indeed had crossed over from the Myanmarese side into Indian territory, and they had plans to inflict huge damage both to the defense and civilian establishments.
Thank you very much, Raghavendra Rao. One question for our international senior correspondent, Ramesh Ramachandran, who's live with us. Ramesh, this is not the only group active in the east and the so-called northeast of India, but what kind of requests are this group? Why are they fighting and targeting the Indian army?
Well, historically speaking, Daniele, the landlocked northeastern states have been insurgency prone, and most of these northeastern states have suffered from insurgency for decades on end now, and many of these insurgent groups find safe havens across the international border in Myanmar. And the NSCN-K faction, or the Khaplang faction, for instance, the leader was based out of Myanmar, but they do carry out cross-border raids in the across the border in India. And we saw that in June 2015, for instance, India did conduct what is described as a surgical strike at the India-Myanmar border. And this morning's operation is seen as being slightly different from the previous operation in 2015, in that the Indian forces did not physically cross the international border, although a firefight did take place and heavy casualties were inflicted on the NSCN-K combatants. Now, that said, we've seen, Daniele, this operation can be seen in two ways. The critics of this government's, this operation in particular, will question the timing of the operation, coming at a time when India is increasingly under pressure to take a stand on the humanitarian crisis facing the Rohingyas of Myanmar. Whereas on the other hand, the proponents or the supporters of this kind of policy will say that India needs Myanmar on its side in order to be able to fight these insurgent groups operating from Myanmar's soil. And therefore, at the moment as things stand, this operation will be used by India to tell the world that India needs Myanmar support to be able to counter and tackle and combat these insurgent groups, especially the NSCN-K faction or the Khaplang faction, which was involved in this morning's operation as well.